Hello again, this is Greg with MVC Tutorials. Today we're going to be going over EntityFramwork. Now you might be asking, Greg, why EntityFramwork if this is an MVC tutorial? Well, if you remember from my original MVC tutorial, that was really not much code, was all just looking at the flow. Repositories where everything comes from. And MVC, not 4, but MVC and Entity have kind of evolved around the same time. Not necessarily that Entity was new, it used to be just strictly called ADO.NET, but EntityFramwork itself has picked up drastically over the last couple of years. So there's two different kinds of entity, and I figured the best way to do this is really through design. There's code first, which allows you to write code, and then depending on how you write your code, like if you put an ID in your model or main class that you want entity to consume, it will consider that a primary key and various other things that it will do for you. So, excuse me. So what I wanted to start with was making a library that was going to consume our entity model. The reason we do this is because we want to separate our entity model via DTOs, which are data transfer objects, from the actual client, which is in this case is our MVC application. Now you can have this library external, in a different solution and consume it, or in the same solution and have a solution folder like I did, which to make a new solution folder like this dependencies, all you have to do is do add new solution folder. It'll make a folder, and then you just type in the name. And then you just right click and do add new project, just like you would from the solution level, and it'll add the project right inside here. And what you want to do, I had gotten a little ahead here in my setup process. I really want to show you, but you click add new item, and then you do Windows and class library, and I named it person library. It's up to you if you want to change the name. You're more than welcome to. So there's where we're starting. Just to give a little background of why we made this library as opposed to consuming it or making a new library and consuming the DLL. In most cases, if you have the library available in code form, you're better off, especially if it's your own library or a teammate's library, and especially if it's in source control, you are much better off consuming the whole, I think it's CS_proj file, which will bring in the whole project, than adding a reference to a binary, or to DLL, I'm sorry. The reason being is because if you just consume a DLL, when there's updates to that project, the DLL does not automatically know that anything happened. It just, it doesn't update. So you have to delete it, go browse for it again, add it. If you add the project as a reference, which you'll see that I did right here, by just right-clicking on references, add reference, and you go to the projects button over here, and then you check the little checkbox to that project and click OK. The reason this is very good is because regardless of whether or not it's in another solution or it's within the same solution, it will update itself automatically as well as update a reference, which is pretty sweet. Because let's say that somebody else is working on a solution that's, especially if it's in source control. Actually, the only way is if it's in source control, because otherwise you wouldn't know anything. But let's just say it's in source control somewhere, and that's this library that a buddy of yours said, oh, this is the greatest string manipulation library, you're going to love it. So you consume it in your new project, and he says, dude, 2 days later he says, dude, I just added, this new for each loop that does all this crazy stuff. And you need to get it, right? So normally, if you just did the DLL, you'd be right-clicking and adding new reference, and you'd have to delete the old reference first. I'm sorry, and then add new reference and add the DLL again. And also, you'd have to reconsume the project if it's in source control. So, or he could email you the DLL. We could go back and forth about the million ways that this could be done. But the moral of this, the point I'm trying to make here is that if he were to make the change and check it into source control, now when you if you either open up the Visual Studio project or you're already in the project and you click on something, anything, Visual Studio will recognize that that project has changed somewhere and ask and tell you and say, hey, we noticed that the project has some changes within the attributes or whatever. Do you want to consume the changes? You say yes, and then this updates, this your project that you consumed updates, and your reference to it updates, which is like the best thing since sliced bread to me. There's no reason why not to do this when you have the opportunity. And I'm sure there's plenty of times you don't have that opportunity, but when you do, it's really a good idea. So before I consume and make an entity model to consume in this library, I want to just give you a tutorial of just a quick overview of the SQL management or the SQL database that I created and the stored procedures that go along with it. Just so you know, I'm not joshing you. So we have this sandbox database. It's on my local machine under SQL Express. We have a persons table with some columns: ID, first name, last name, age, team ID. And we have a teams table, which is columns has just an ID and the team name. Now there is a foreign key between the team's ID and the person's team ID. These are, if you notice FK, there's a foreign key between that field and this field. Okay, what foreign key means is that if you're going to put something in this table, and this is not null, so there always has to be something in this table, it must match something with it, or you're always going to fill this row, I'm sorry. So whatever you put in this row must fit something in this row. That's how they're connected. Okay, so you can't randomly put some GUID in here and break the whole process. Now there's good and bad things to foreign keys. That's good for another tutorial, but I just want to let you know that that is hooked together, because you're going to see that Entity will show a workflow table for you, which is pretty sweet. And then what we have here is we have three store procedures: add person, add team, get person by first name. They've already been set up, they've been run, they haven't been tested, but I'm fairly confident that they probably work just fine. Okay, so that's all the database stuff. This isn't a database tutorial, so I don't want to go into it too much, but I just want to make sure you knew that this wasn't like hocus pocus. Because there is also, Entity has two flavors. One is design first, which is the way we're going to do it. The other is code first, which means that you write all your classes, and you write them in such a way with certain meta tags on the properties themselves, of the properties in the classes. And by doing that in such a way, Entity will consume that class and make a table and a database for you off of that. That's how it's code first, because you write the code, and then Entity consumes that code and throws it in the database. It's cool. It's got its perks. I personally rather do it the other way, because I'm much more of a visual person and a layout person, so I'll write the UML out by hand and then kind of structure how I want the properties, and I'll throw it in a table and I'll consume it. It's just a personal preference, but I see more people using design first myself. So now we're going to add the entity model, or ADO.NET, as it's labeled in the templates. So we right click and do add new item, and then we've got ADO.NET model. You can change this or you can keep it model 1. I usually like to make it a little different, so I'll do person model, do an add. Now you can make an entity model if you want. Okay, I don't really do this. What you can do is you make an empty model and then you can drag stuff on and a whole bunch of stuff. I'd prefer, since I'm making the table, I like making all the tables and databases in SQL first. I generate it from the database, so that's the way we're going to do it. And you click next, and then if you already have made a connection through a different process in the project, you can, take from the drop down. In this case we haven't, so we're going to do a new connection. And then let's hit our drop down here, and we'll wait a minute here. Okay, so now I'm picking my local machine. In most scenarios, if you're using regular SQL Server, that will be enough. The server name. In my case, because if you notice at the top of SQL Management Studio, I did /SQL Express. So in this case, because we're doing it that way, you got to do /SQL Express. We're going to use Windows Authentication, and then we're going to select the table we want. In this case, it's Sandbox. I always like to test connection. Comes back real quick, and then we click OK. Okay, and now here is your actual unique string. And this is the metadata, the entity connection string, which will end up in your app config file whenever you're doing a class library or a web app, or a web, no, not a WCF service either, class library or a Windows form or a WPF application. Whenever it's a web service or a web application, it'll end up in your web config. But for right now, it's going to be quote-unquote the app config, and we're going to move it to the web config later in a different tutorial. This tutorial, I can already tell, is going long, so it's probably going to be a two-step tutorial. And then sandbox entities, take note of the name that you use there, because you're going to use it in your using statements to consume the entity or the context, and then to make the routine calls. So then we're going to click Next. Okay, so now it's got your visualizations of your tables. You can choose which tables you want. It doesn't have to be all of them. You can either select that to get all of them, but in this case I don't want even sys diagrams. We're just going to do person and teams. And then you can go to your store procedures. And they actually break it up, by the way, by schema. So normally I do different schemas for things. It will have a different drop down for each schema. So now we've got add person, add team, get person by first name, get team by name, just like we had before, right? We already know. And then this is the name of the model. You'll see this again really quickly, so there's no real big push to remember that name, but the other one you do need to know. I usually keep all these to default. You can mess with them if you want. I'll show you exactly what this means. Import selected store procedures and functions into the entity model. That just saves you time. You have to make the functions anyway if you don't, so you might as well check it. You include foreign key columns. It depends on if you have foreign keys. It might not matter, but when I don't have foreign keys, it doesn't affect it, so you might as well just leave it checked. And then pluralize or singularize generated object names. The reason that where this comes in is because if you notice, this here is persons and teams, right? Now what's going to happen is entity is going to make the object person and team. And you might say, well, Greg, why? That's not a one-for-one. Well, it kind of is. Here's the deal. The object itself is a singular instance of it. The table is rows of that object, so it is multiple or plural of that object, so that's why you use persons or teams. If you don't use that, if I remember correctly, it uses a one-for-one at that point if you just call it person. So that's what that means. If you uncheck that, I would guess that it probably would keep the plural name and do a one-for-one. This is telling it, hey, do it on your own. I'm trusting that you're going to do it right. So now we're all done. You see, there's no next, so you just hit finish. It's going to do its thing. Download everything, and then you're going to see this nice, pretty little diagram here, which is pretty sweet. When it is done doing whatever it's doing, it's pretty sweet, I promise. Okay, so this is your foreign key relationship right here. Okay, and you'll notice it's hooked to team by its ID. So and this is hooked, and it knows that it's hooked to persons, which is awesome. So now you'll see the little star here. We'll just save it so that it knows that I want to keep this look of the diagram. And now let me just check time here. Oh, we're at 14 minutes, so I'm going to stop this right where we are. We're at a good stopping point. And next tutorial, we'll go through all these features of the entity object, and we'll see where we can go from there. Alright, so thank you very much for listening, and if you like what you hear, go to my web blog. It's HTTP object reference hell.com. Sorry, that was a mouthful. So it's http://objectreferencehell.com. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.